good friend Will, who was, we've often chatted right at the beginning of the cogitations about these symposia, because he's been extremely helpful in kind of some initial brainstorming here too. And of course, he loved the idea of this concept of honoring great collectors. The problem was that he's known a lot of them, and which one or ones would he speak of? And there are two that are, of course, hugely important. And I guess we just were forced to decide that he had to speak about both of them. Just because I wouldn't want to have had this event without having both of them addressed. So, you know, understandably, you'll be getting the short versions of their biographies and all the anecdotes and fun stories that Will could tell. But at least this will be an introduction to both of these people. Seth Atwood, of course, we don't need to say more about. We've heard about him often already, but Will's in a special position to speak of someone he worked with and knew well for many years. Kelly Edey was such an interesting character, and I've done some research on Kelly Edey myself. And I didn't want to avoid him either, just because you know, he's unusual and special in so many ways that, and he's a newcomer to Clock Heaven compared to some of these other people, but he's sitting around the table there too, although he's probably still sleeping, as usual. But he should have been mentioned too, so I'm extremely grateful to Will that he was willing to tackle both of these men within his allotted time. So, Will Andrews. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bob.
This is the vodka.
I'll stop with that. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Bob, for the opportunity to speak about two dear friends who influenced both my life and my career. It's not an easy task to do justice to them in the limited time of this talk, but I hope to introduce you in a way that you won't forget them. Seth Atwood was 93 years old when he died. I met him in 1975 when he was 58 and I was 25, and we developed a close friendship through the building of the Time Museum's collection and his publications. Between 1968 and 1986, a mere 18 years, Seth established the world's most comprehensive collection of timekeeping devices from the earliest period to the present day. In doing so, he transformed the field of antiquarian horology, creating opportunities for dealers, scholars, students, and the trade, and inspiring other collectors. Referring to his own particular field, George Daniels summed up Seth's contributions to horology as follows. Never before in the history of watchmaking has so great a surprise confronted so many horologists. George was as surprised as we all were. Kellogg Winthrop Edey, who we all called Kelly, had no such organized goal in mind. He was just consumed with a passion for clocks, in particular French clocks, in which he discovered a beautiful confluence of the art and craft of keeping time. The all-consuming passion for this subject is sometimes referred to as the horological virus, because once you catch it, it will remain with you for the rest of your life. Some collectors, like Kelly Edey, remained interested in adding to their collections right up to the end of their lives. Seth Atwood was the only person I have known who was ever cured and stopped collecting. While many of the finest pieces from Kelly Edey's collection were bequeathed to the Frick collection in New York, where some of you may have come to see the exhibition there called The Art of the Timekeeper about 20 years ago now. There is no trace whatever of Seth Atwood's collection today except for the publications, the auction catalogues, and in the memories of those who knew the Time Museum. Although I was heartbroken when I was told in 1986 that the collection would no longer have the permanence that I had always assumed and believed it would have, in retrospect, Seth in some way did the most generous thing he could have done. He sought no memorial for himself, Rather than burden his own family with the expense and responsibility of keeping a museum, he decided to give other collectors the opportunity of acquiring the masterpieces that had given him such pleasure. Today, there is no trace of the Clock Tower Inn, where the Time Museum was located. The once thriving conference centre and resort that surrounded it has disappeared without trace. The land is once again flat, like the cornfields that occupied it 60 years ago. Had you told me at the Time Museum's pinnacle in 1984 that the entire collection would be sold in 20 years and that in 34 years all the buildings would be demolished, I would never have believed it. No one would at the time. In 1975, I was teaching 2 days a week at Eton and working the other 3 days on the clocks at the Old Royal Observatory and National Maritime Museum. It was just a part-time job in those days. Spending much of my time organising an exhibition to commemorate the bicentenary of John Harrison's birth. My boss, who oversaw the Department of Astronomy and Navigation, was Commander Derek Howes. One day, Derek called me into his office and asked me if I would like to join him for lunch with a very important American collector called Seth Atwood, who was visiting London with his wife and wanted to see the horological collections at Greenwich. Having been reassured that I wouldn't be gate-crashing a private lunch, I agreed. On the appointed day, Tuesday the 8th of July, Derek was delayed by an urgent matter, and so he asked me to go ahead and meet the Atwoods at the Trafalgar Tavern. I had no idea what they looked like. All Derek had told me was that Mr. Atwood was very rich. I had never been to America before, so I immediately thought of the movies and had an image of the Wild West. But I couldn't see anyone who looked like John Wayne with a big Texan hat. So I asked the maitre d', who directed me to a table in the corner where an elegant couple was sitting quietly, deep in conversation. They both stood up as I neared the table. Seth and his wife, Pat, were both elegantly dressed and had impeccable manners. Seth was tall, with grey hair, gracious and polite. Pat was kind and thoughtful and had a commanding presence that made you want to be on your best behaviour. Our conversation never faltered. After lunch, I gave them a tour of the observatory and its horological collection, and then escorted them up to the National Maritime Museum to see the display of Harrison's timekeepers, which at that time were displayed down the hill. A few months later, I received a letter inviting me on a 3-week visit to the Time Museum to restore some of the clocks. This was followed in 1976 by an 8-month visit on the same mission, after which, in November 1977, I accepted Seth Atwood's offer to move to the USA and become the curator of the collection. Seth Atwood was a Renaissance man. He saw himself primarily as a businessman, but he was also an inventor, an entrepreneur, an educator, a philanthropist, a publisher, a problem solver, a collector, and most of all, someone who cherished the friendships that he had made through collecting as much as he did the artifacts that he acquired. He was always well dressed, but was often seen drinking a can of Coke and smoking a cigarette. After graduating from Stanford in 1938 and serving in the US Navy during the war, he joined the Atwood Vacuum Machine Company, the business that his father and uncle had founded in 1909. In 1953, he became its president. Now, I should explain a little, this is where the family money came from. Old Mr. Atwood, Seth B. Atwood, bought a Buick in 1916, and it had a rattly door. And so he devised a door bumper to stop the door from rattling, and he thought it was a good idea. So he took it to the chief engineer, General Motors, And the engineer said, this is 1916, you know, we're advanced here, we can't stop production and put this little door bumper on. And sure enough, the next model that came out had a door bumper going round the patent, trying to get round his patent that he'd taken out. And Seth B was not going to take that line down. So he went to the chairman's office and he had someone bring him sandwiches, and he sat for 3 days until the chairman finally saw it. And then he got his first contract, first of all to produce these door bumpers, and then they expanded by 1920 into door catches, door hinges, all kinds of automotive hardware. Those of you who have hatchbacks with those pistons, they're an Atwood invention as well. There were all kinds of things, so that the company became very, very wealthy. Now, some of you who came out to the Time Museum may have seen his car that he designed. This was back in the early, well, the late 70s, early 80s. He was just way ahead of his time. Gasoline was going up, and he thought, let's get a really efficient car. And so he designed this three-wheel car. It never caught on. He did drive one. He had a gasoline model and an electric model, and he drove it to and from Chicago. But the cost of actually going into production was prohibitive, so he never did. And he had 3 or 4 people working. They were actually designing the car and everything, but he was coming up with ideas. And then in the 80s, he had this idea for this yacht. He heard about these 2 German diesel engines, which drove the Leopard tank. They were incredibly powerful. He thought, why not use them on a boat? So he built this super yacht, which had a hot tub in the back. And his daughter, Edey, Diane, helped to design the interior. He lived in Rockford, on the Rock River. For a man who was that wealthy, you know, this was a very sort of modest house. And they found this special stone, this fossilized limestone, quarried, and they had it shipped to Rockford from Texas. So the house was a sort of elegant, modern house. You would have never known, looking at it, that Atwood was the richest man in town, but everybody knew it. Now the first watch, he came up with his idea. He was 50 years old, and he decided he was going to build a collection. It was going to be a small collection, but one that illustrated the whole history of time measurement. And so he read numerous books and made out a wish list of 100 pieces, because he thought he could tell the history of time measurement to the greatest makers with 100 pieces. So he went to London, and he saw the dealers there. And the dealers thought, this man is crazy. He's asking for all these makers. It's like someone collecting art, saying, well, I want a Giotto, I want a Cimabue, I want a Michelangelo, a Raphael, a Leonardo, a nice Leonardo would be good. You know? And the dealers, you know, realized, you know, this man looks genuine, but we never see these things, and if we did, the price would be astronomical. So nearly all of them just thought he was a bit of a joke. And then one man did take him seriously, and that was Robert Fuchs, who was a dealer who lived outside Oxford. And so sat down to lunch with him, and they had a long chat and explained the goal that he was doing. And Fuchs at the end of lunch said, well, actually there is a watch coming up at Sotheby's, and it's very good, it's a Tonkian. I would recommend you buy it. It'd be a good piece for you to have. And so Robert said, how much should I bid to you? Mr. Atwood said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, well, everyone has a limit. He said, what do you mean? He said, well, I want to protect you. He said, why do I need protecting? You know, I spent the last hour telling you what I want to do, and now you're putting a limit on it. So Robert Fuchs went off to the auction the next day, and the bidding went up, and the newspaper the next day said highest price ever paid for an English watch. And Robert Fuchs just felt absolutely awful, so he sort of delayed calling Seth. And eventually, he did. And he said, "Mr. Atwood?" He said, "Yes, Robert, I know." He said, "You don't have to tell me the story. I already know it, and I'm delighted. But I can tell you something that you don't know." He said, "Last night I was called by Sam Bloomfield, who Darren said was this great collector in California, who offered me twice the price, because he never thought anyone would bid that high." And so this was the beginning of the collection. His private collection. In the following year, that was in 1968, 1969, he was expanding, and he had been chasing this watch, the Henry Graves watch. And I'll just tell a part of the story because it explains the kind of man Seth Atwood was. Pete Fullerton had it, and Seth would go and meet up with him several times, and that was on one of the occasions, and they were drinking way into the night. And Seth never even mentioned the watch. They'd discussed it before and everything, and quite out of the blue, Pete Fullerton suddenly said, "I'll send you the watch." So Seth said, "How much?" And he said, $200,000. Cash. So I said, "Fine." Okay. So the next day, Mr. Atwood goes off to the bank, and goes up to the clerk, and writes a check for $200,000. "Can you give me $200,000? Of course, the bank, the lady behind the desk said, "Well, I've got to see the bank manager." So they went back to see the bank manager, and he said, "Well, Mr. Atwood, I need to know two things. I need to know that you are who you say you are, but I need to know that you can afford it." And so he said, "Call this number." He said, "I want you to speak to a man called Lauren Graham." So he called, and the phone answered, United Bank of Illinois, and said, "Can I speak to Lauren Graham?" And so he came on the phone, and the bank manager said, "Look, I have this gentleman in front of me. He's very well dressed in a suit and a tie. Can you describe what he looks like?" And he said, "Well, is he smoking a cigarette?" "Yes." "Does he have a can of Coke in his hand?" "Yes." So that's it. Then he said, "Well, now I need to know, can he afford it?" And he said, "Well, he owns this bank." Seth Atwood soon outgrew his home. He bought the Orville Hagen's clock collection and added to his collection. It went well over 100 pieces. So he purchased this motel on the outskirts of town, and this was about 1969 or so, 1970, and rebuilt, then expanded it. This was a shop, this particular shop was taken around 1984, when they had just done a big new addition that some of you may remember. Here is Seth and Pat with Mudge Green that he purchased in 1976. Eugene Trench, who was one of the big dealers at that time, had just delivered it, and so it was a major acquisition. I should hasten to add that it was Pat Atwood who, in fact, was responsible for the interior of the museum. And those of you who visited there will remember the sort of plush green carpet, and it was laid out in a very elegant way, where it was more like a living room. She wanted people to be able to enjoy it as if they were visiting her house. She didn't want them there, but wanted them to really enjoy it. So this is a view of the collection around sort of 1984. You'll see the Harrison regulator on the left, the Williamson double dial. There were many absolute masterpieces, wonderful clocks. When I went there, it was about 1,250 pieces. This was my first visit in 1975. When I left, there were about 3 times as many, and a very substantial library. So it was a remarkable collection. He collected across the gamut, all different nationalities, all different periods. We went up, not so much in the electronic age, but to the atomic clock. The Renaissance clocks, this is one by a chariot clock, illustrating the mythical gluttonous king called Gambrinus. This was probably made around 1620 in Augsburg. And when the clock struck, the chariot would move forward down the table. The elephants would rear their heads, and Camprinus would raise his tankard in a sort of cheers. And then the elephant clock had a pendulum, its tail wagged like a pendulum, but it was a sort of automata clock, which probably had a pendulum added, but it was quite fun. Seth Atwood also, as Darren mentioned, commissioned things to be made when they didn't exist. He just didn't want to be a collector of the past. He wanted to illustrate. If it never survived, he wanted to show people what it looked like. So he spent a very substantial sum of money on these things. The Dondi clock, he went to see Geoffrey Buggins, who we saw a picture of this morning at Thwaites and Reed, because he knew he could sort of make a copy of the Dondi. And Mr. Buggins said, "Look, Mr. Atwood, this is 1972, we're a production company, we can't just make one." So Atwood said, "Well, can you make me 3? Well, poor Mr. Buggins was a bit stuck there, so he agreed. And of course, by the time the week was out, he had called the Science Museum, they had got one, and then someone else had got another one. So there's no, he just wanted this to happen, so he made it happen. And Fred Fryer, Fred Fryer, who was a great engraver, he did all the engraving on this, and Peter Haywood built the clock itself. He worked there, and then when Peter went out on his own, he was commissioned by Atwood to build the Wallingford clock, where he worked with John North, the great historian, who discovered the silver manuscript in the Bodleian Library, and wanted to make it possible to be able to, so people could actually see what this clock may have looked like. Did I miss one? Okay, actually, may have done. Yeah, Dear George. I wanted to include this just because Seth commissioned a number of people to make special pieces for him. He wanted to be their work. He didn't want it to be a copy of something else. So he was the first one to go to George and ask George to make him something original. He said, "I don't want a copy of a Breguet." If you look at George's early watches, you know, they are really copies of Breguet. They're beautiful. It's not damnable at all. But he said to George, "I want it to be something original, something of yours." Of course, George loved that. No one had asked him to do that before. And so here he is with the film. Many of you have seen it. If you haven't, you should Google it. There's a wonderful film about Atwood and George talking. We had this catalogue project going. This picture shows John Leopold in the middle, Claire Vincent, who used to be Deckard-Roth's assistant curator at the Met, and Bruce Chandler, who's a dear friend. And I appointed him as general editor of the collection. And although Seth had already started hiring various people to write up the collection and describe it, Anthony Turner was one, Simon Bull was involved, there were a few others. I tried, one of my most joyful tasks was to hire people who were specialists in each area to come to the museum and write things up. One of my nightmares was it took so much of my time when they came, so I organized them to come in groups. And on one occasion I had John Leopold, who many of you know was a great expert on a number of things, but Renaissance clocks among others. Kelly Edey, who does French clocks, Anthony Randall, who is a great maker and specializes in precision, and Barry Hutchinson, who used to be at the British Museum. So they were all there in the room together, and my nightmare was when one of them would say, "Oh," because everyone else would stop work, and they'd immediately go over. We were paying these people by the hour. So I had to try to keep them apart, but keep them together. But anyway, it was a tragedy because it would have been an encyclopedia of time measurement. Yeah, that was the sort of idea behind it. And although the first books we put out, the first ones finished, Astrolabe and Astrolabe Quadrants and time measuring instruments, both by Anthony Turner. But they weren't big sellers because not so many people are interested. But once you start getting a whole volume, an encyclopedia, regardless whether you're interested in those things, you're going to buy those early volumes. So I had every confidence that by the time we came out with other books on, you know, American clocks and French clocks and English clocks and things, people would want to start putting the set together. But unfortunately, the Atwoods decided to cut off the project, and I pleaded with them to have two books which were basically finished: Donald Polk's American Watches and Anthony Randall's Chronometers. And they're both very, very good reference books if you want to see them. One of the people, as I mentioned, who I got to know was Kellogg and Winthrop, Edey. Edey was a remarkable person in so many ways. He was just passionate about French clocks and Renaissance clocks to some degree. He lived a very unusual lifestyle, to put it mildly. Let me just check a few notes here. Kelly was 20 years younger than Seth and died almost 11 years to the day before him. He contracted the horological virus at a very early age and never recovered from his all-consuming interest in clocks. As the grandson of Morris W. Kellogg, an engineer who made a fortune designing and building oil refineries and World War II atomic bomb plants, Kelly inherited enough money to never have to work for a living. So after growing up in Upper Brookville on the Long Island, graduating from Amherst College and studying at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, he found himself at liberty to spend the rest of his life doing exactly what he felt like doing. His day always began in the afternoon. And he would be very annoyed if the children in the playground next door had the audacity to wake him before 2 p.m. Kathy and I remember well how he gets so upset. 1 week before his 13th birthday, he began his clock journal as follows. It said, "Clock book, started on Sunday, June 11, 1950. At the present time, I have 17 clocks and 4 watches." Kelly was a Manhattan eccentric. This picture on the left is taken from Andy Warhol's film, 13 Most Beautiful Boys. He was a devoted diarist. He wrote every night when he got home, he would write up the day, describing exactly what he thought about the people he had met that day. And this is quite scary to some people in New York because he has all kinds of secrets that they shouldn't be told. John Redfern knew him well at the end of his life. He was an excellent writer. He was a photographer and above all, a passionate collector. There was, however, a problem with the income from his inheritance. It was never quite enough to keep up with his expensive taste in clocks. Therefore, from time to time, he had to work. Due to his boundless interest in French clocks, he was recognized as one of the great experts in the world, if not the leading experts on them. And so when Gillian Wilson at the Getty wanted to catalog their French clocks, she hired Kelly. So it was natural for me when I wanted to hire him. I'd already met him through the American section of the AHS, which he was a member. But I thought, you know, I should talk to Gillian and find out, you know, how would it be to hire him. She said, "Oh, Will, I can't stand him. He drives me mad." He said he's never here until the afternoon. He complains because he can't sleep. And she was going on. And so it ended up with us, I talked to Kelly and I said, okay, we went to have a sort of price that he would be paid, and I had to buy a thick foam rubber mattress it would keep in the workshop. So every time Kelly came, we would move that into the hotel room. But he was quite a character. And Jonathan Sternberg did an amazing job hiring him for Christie's. Some of you may have seen those extraordinary catalogue entries that he wrote for them. This is one of his photographs that he took. He always took someone along with him because he had this massive camera with a huge tripod. And the poor unfortunate chap had to carry the camera around, and then Kelly would set it up, take a picture, and they had to go on to the next place. So it sounded fun. We're going to Italy, but it wasn't quite as much fun for the person carrying the camera. Here he is in his living room after just buying this clock by Gioret, with a case by André Charboul. It's a barometer clock, a very early barometer. There are a few clocks of this model. I used to remember exactly how many there were, I can't remember now. But anyway, it was one of his prized possessions. So he bought this in 1965 when he was 28. That's Kelly with Kathy. He had mostly French clocks, but he had some English clocks. This is a fantastic clock by Edward East with an olive wood case. His pieces were just priceless. This is his sort of sitting room with some of the pieces there. He's left the house as it was. He lived on West 83rd, 14 West 83rd, and the house had been sort of preserved in its original condition. And it was just gorgeous. It just had such a lovely feel to it. The old toilet, and I think it even was sort of enameled on the inside. But there were so many details to his house. John Redfern had the pleasure of seeing this, and some of the photos come from him, and I thank you, John. This is his bedroom, and a particular amusement to me. I mean, this is the only place you have to sit in the room, and he wanted to look through his library, he sort of sat on the bed. But there was this bookcase, and you can see on the top, he's got two Horology regulators, two Renaissance clocks, and a little French Renaissance clock. And it was one of these bookcases like this. And it was just terrifying, don't go too close, don't move anything. And he had a method of design. Of course, he ran out of bookshelf space fairly quickly, so he stacked his books on the floor. The biggest book was always on the top, so he would only have to dust one book. And this is my last slide, showing Kelly with his tape de coupé clock, which I saw in Lord Percy's collection. It's interesting. But it's a style of French clock called tape de coupé, but it was very much Kelly's sense of humour to be the doll's head himself. So anyway, thank you all very much for listening.